It was a night soaked in rain, the streets glistening with the reflections of distant city lights as Jackson Blake made his way home, after yet another lavish gala. The kind of event where people smiled with their teeth, but wore masks in their hearts. Jackson, a high-profile millionaire and heir to one of the city's most powerful business empires, knew this game all too well. His face was always on the covers of magazines, but few knew the true Jackson, a man who'd built his empire with cold calculations and ruthless ambition. The world saw the polished, confident businessman, but few realized how lonely and haunted he truly was behind the sharp suits and expensive ties. Tonight, though, his usual cold demeanor was replaced by something different, an odd sense of unease that seemed to linger in the air, like a storm ready to break. As Jackson drove through the empty streets, the steady hum of his sleek car was the only sound cutting through the night, broken only by the occasional splash of raindrops hitting the windshield. Suddenly, the car skidded, tires screeching as Jackson struggled to regain control. His heart jolted as something dark darted across the road. A woman, drenched, covered in dirt, and blood-stained, stood in front of his car. Her eyes wide with panic. It all happened in an instant, and in a desperate move, Jackson swerved the wheel, narrowly avoiding her. The tires screeched again, this time coming to a halt mere inches from the stranger. The woman stumbled forward, collapsing against the side of his car. She was gasping for breath, her face pale, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. Her clothes were torn, and her hands trembled as they reached out, almost begging for help. She had clearly been running from something or someone. Jackson's first instinct was to drive away, but he couldn't ignore the strange pull in his gut, the urgency in her eyes that made it impossible to simply leave her behind. Without a second thought, he opened the door and helped her inside. She flinched when the door slammed shut, her eyes darting nervously around. The moment she sat down, she gasped, trying to control her breathing. "I'm Sophie Bennett," she managed to say between shallow breaths, her voice hoarse, barely audible. There was an edge to it, a rawness that spoke of someone who had been through more than her fair share of pain. But there was something else, an intensity in the way she looked at him, something deeper than just fear. As Jackson glanced at her, he could feel it. There was more to her story, something dark lurking just beneath the surface. He didn't have to ask. Her eyes told him everything. She wasn't just running from a random assailant. No, this was bigger, more dangerous. She wasn't just running, she was fleeing for her life. As the car accelerated into the night, Sophie's gaze shifted toward the rearview mirror. A black SUV had appeared behind them, its headlights glaring through the mist of the rain. Sophie's grip on the seat tightened, her fear palpable. "Drive faster," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. Jackson's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his pulse quickened. The SUV was gaining on them, its headlights like a predator stalking its prey. Sophie didn't need to say another word. Jackson's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, and the sleek car surged forward. But something gnawed at him. Who were these people chasing her? Why were they so desperate to find her? Despite his usually controlled demeanor, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this encounter, was about to change everything for him. He glanced at Sophie, her eyes wide with terror, but there was something else, a truth buried beneath her fear. The mystery was just beginning. And for the first time in a long while, Jackson Blake didn't know what would come next. The days after Sophie's sudden appearance at his doorstep felt like a haze for Jackson. A mixture of unease and intrigue clouded his thoughts. Sophie was unlike anyone he'd ever met, a woman desperate for answers, yet one who seemed guarded, like a fortress of secrets. She was a mystery wrapped in vulnerability, and Jackson found himself increasingly drawn to her, despite his better judgment. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began to share snippets of her life, enough to give Jackson a glimpse into her troubled past, but never enough to reveal the whole story. It started with small details. She had once lived in a grand mansion on the outskirts of the city, the daughter of a well-known businessman. She described how, in her younger years, her life had been filled with luxuries, gardens sprawling across acres, private jets, and gala events. She spoke of it all with a bittersweet sadness, as if those memories were something she could never return to. But the turning point came when Sophie spoke of her father's sudden disappearance. Jackson listened carefully, sensing the weight of her words as she recounted the night her father, Mark Bennett, vanished. She claimed that Mark had been ambitious, a man who built an empire from nothing, but who became tangled in dangerous business dealings with powerful, corrupt individuals. The last time Sophie saw him, he was on the verge of a breakthrough in his career. Then, one evening, he disappeared without a trace. Her voice dropped lower as she explained how her mother had died shortly after, of a sudden, unexplained illness. Sophie had been left alone at a young age, her father's disappearance still a mystery. She'd been forced to fend for herself after her family's fortune crumbled. "The people my father dealt with," she said softly, "they weren't like the businessmen your family deals with. They were dangerous. And they never stopped looking for him." Jackson couldn't shake the disquiet that began to stir in him. There was something unsettling in the way Sophie avoided discussing certain details, especially her father's business dealings. It was clear that she knew more than she was telling, but she wasn't ready to open up about it. Every time Jackson asked questions about her father's business, Sophie would deflect, changing the subject or becoming visibly uncomfortable. It was as though her father's past was something so dark, it was too dangerous to even speak about. Jackson didn't fully believe her story, but he couldn't deny the way she carried herself. There was authenticity in her pain. The more time they spent together, the more he found himself questioning the gaps in her story. Was she hiding something? Was her father's disappearance linked to something deeper? Was she involved, or was she simply a victim of circumstances? Her distance, her reluctance to delve deeper into her family's past, it all left Jackson with a gnawing sense of unease. And yet, it only made him want to understand her more, to discover the truth. As the days passed, Sophie's mystery became all-consuming, and he couldn't help but be drawn to her vulnerability. Something about her haunted him, just as much as her presence intrigued him. Over the following weeks, Sophie and Jackson began to spend more time together. They found comfort in their shared loneliness, each one drawing strength from the other's company. Despite their differences, they grew closer. Sophie's guarded nature was a puzzle Jackson felt compelled to solve, while Sophie found solace in Jackson's quiet strength. He was a man of action, cold and controlled, yet she saw glimpses of warmth hidden beneath his surface. They began to share their personal stories. Sophie opened up about her mother's sudden death, and how it had left her feeling utterly betrayed. "My mother, she never had a chance," Sophie confided one evening, sitting across from Jackson at the fireplace. "Her illness was so sudden. One day she was fine. The next, gone. And then my father disappeared. Just like that, everything was gone." Her voice cracked slightly, the sorrow in her eyes speaking more than words ever could. Jackson felt the weight of her pain, and couldn't help but feel empathy for the woman who had lost everything. Jackson, in turn, opened up about his own family. He spoke of his strained relationship with his father, Richard Blake, a man who had been cold and calculating his entire life, molding Jackson to take over the family business. "My father, he never loved me," Jackson said, the bitterness in his voice impossible to hide. "He only cared about power, wealth. Everything I did was a means to an end for him. I don't even know if he ever cared about me as a person." Their shared vulnerabilities seemed to create a bridge between them, yet something lingered just beneath the surface, a tension neither of them could quite put into words. They were connected, yes, but still distant in ways they couldn't explain. One night, as they sat across from one another over dinner, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Jackson, perhaps more out of curiosity than anything else, brought up his uncle, Edward Blake, the man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. The mention of his uncle's name immediately caused Sophie's expression to shift. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darkened. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, noticing her reaction. "I didn't mean to upset you." Sophie quickly regained her composure, but Jackson couldn't ignore the unease in her eyes. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. "Your uncle, he disappeared a long time ago, didn't he?" Sophie said, her voice faltering for the first time. Yes, Jackson replied, sensing her discomfort. He was involved in something shady, but no one ever knew exactly what happened. I don't think anyone cared to look. Sophie's eyes hardened, and she suddenly stood up from the table, excusing herself. Her abruptness caught Jackson off guard. He wanted to press her for answers, but something in her reaction told him it wasn't the right time. The rest of the evening was strained, and the tension between them only grew. Sophie had always been a mystery, but now Jackson knew there was something deeper, something about his uncle's disappearance, something that Sophie knew, that she wasn't telling him. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he had them. The following night, Jackson returned to his estate after a late business meeting, his mind still preoccupied with the thoughts of Sophie's reaction to his uncle. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an innocent avoidance. Sophie knew more than she was letting on. When he entered the house, however, he was met with an unsettling silence. Sophie's room was empty. His first thought was that she had gone out, perhaps for a walk to clear her head, but as the hours passed, his concern turned to panic. He checked every room in the house, calling out for her, but there was no sign of Sophie. In his panic, Jackson raced through the house, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, in the third-floor hallway, he saw the door to an unused room ajar. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. Through the crack in the door, he saw Sophie, sitting on the floor, surrounded by old family photographs, many of which Jackson recognized from his childhood. She hadn't heard him approach, and for a moment, Jackson simply stood there, watching her. Sophie's face was pale, her eyes glazed with intensity as she flipped through the photographs. In her hands was one of his uncle, Edward Blake, taken years ago. Sophie. Jackson's voice cracked the stillness of the room. Sophie jumped, her body jerking as though she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have. She quickly wiped away a tear, but Jackson had already seen the vulnerability in her eyes. She hadn't been just looking at pictures, she had been searching for something. Something that tied her past to his family's history. Her voice was soft when she spoke. I didn't mean for you to find out, she whispered, her tone tinged with regret. Jackson stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing. Find out what? What's going on, Sophie? Sophie stood up, her hands shaking. I never wanted you to know the truth, she said, her words coming out in a rush. But your uncle, he was involved in my father's disappearance. And I've been looking for the answers for years. Jackson's world tilted as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sophie wasn't just a victim, she was tied to the Blake family, and their past, their darkest secrets, were interwoven with her own. The truth was far darker than Jackson had ever imagined, and Sophie was at the center of it all. The storm had long passed, leaving the night air crisp and clear, but inside Jackson's mansion, the tension was thick, suffocating even. Sophie stood before him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The weight of the truth was pressing on her chest, threatening to burst out, and she knew it was time. She couldn't keep running, not anymore. Jackson, she began, her voice trembling slightly, there's something you need to understand. Her gaze flickered to the floor, unwilling to meet his eyes. But Jackson could see the internal struggle within her, the hesitancy, the pain, the fear of what would happen once the truth was out. He waited, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. What are you talking about, Sophie? She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his for the first time, in what felt like forever. I am the daughter of your uncle. Edward Blake, your late uncle. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to close in around him. What? His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, disbelief making his chest tighten. No, that's impossible. My uncle, he disappeared years ago. Everyone thought he was dead. How could you possibly? I'm his daughter, Sophie repeated, her voice more forceful now. And I've been running for my life ever since. My family was once wealthy, Jackson. We had everything. My father, he was ambitious, just like your family. He built an empire, just like yours. But when things went wrong, when his business collapsed, everything changed. Sophie's eyes were full of haunted memories as she continued. After my father's death, I was left with nothing. No money, no family. Just the remnants of what had once been a legacy, and a group of dangerous men who wanted everything we had. Jackson stood frozen, trying to process what he was hearing. The idea that Sophie, this woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly, was tied to his uncle's death was too much to fathom. But Sophie's pain was real. The truth was beginning to reveal itself, and Jackson's world was tilting on its axis. She wiped her eyes, struggling to keep her emotions in check. My father's death wasn't an accident, Jackson, Sophie continued, her voice raw with grief. He was murdered. Killed by the very people who brought your family's empire to its knees. Those same men, they've been after me for years. They think I know where the fortune is hidden, your family's fortune. And they'll stop at nothing to find me. Jackson's head spun. His uncle, Edward Blake, had been connected to a web of lies, deceit, and murder, and Sophie had been running from the very men who had plotted his downfall. Jackson's blood ran cold as he began to realize the magnitude of what Sophie was telling him. The fortune? Jackson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? What fortune? Sophie's expression hardened, and she took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Your uncle knew something. He knew about a secret your family has been hiding, a secret that could destroy everything your father's built. It's the one thing that would have torn the Blake empire apart if it had been made public. And my father, he was the one person who knew how to expose it. Jackson's mind raced. His uncle had been involved in something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. So you're telling me my uncle, he was murdered for this secret? Sophie nodded, her eyes dark with the pain of years spent running from the truth. Yes. Your uncle wasn't just a casualty of business rivalry. He was silenced because he had information that could have brought down the most powerful people in this city. And now they're after me, because they believe I hold the key to finding it. Jackson was paralyzed, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. His own flesh and blood had been caught up in a conspiracy that reached beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The thought that his family's success might have been built on lies, on murder, was almost too much to bear. But as the pieces fell into place, he realized that everything he had known about the Blakes and their empire was now in question. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Jackson's voice was tight, filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Why keep running? Why not trust me? Sophie's face softened, and she took a hesitant step toward him. Because I didn't know if I could trust you. And I didn't want to pull you into this world. I didn't want to destroy the one thing you've built. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I didn't want to drag you into a fight that's not yours. Jackson took a step back, his hands running through his hair as he tried to make sense of everything. His mind was a tangled mess of confusion, betrayal, and disbelief. He'd spent his whole life building an empire, and now, he was realizing that it had been built on the backs of lies, secrets, and the blood of his own family. And Sophie, the woman he had begun to trust, was the one who held the key to unraveling it all. As Sophie revealed more, the plot began to take shape. Sophie's father, Mark Bennett, had been a key player in the business world, a man with connections to some of the most powerful figures in the city. His downfall had been the result of a ruthless conspiracy, and his murder had been orchestrated by a group of corrupt business leaders who were hell-bent on securing their own interests. They've been searching for me ever since, Sophie said. Because I know what my father knew. I know what my father had, something he kept hidden from everyone. Jackson felt sick. His world was spinning. These men who had murdered his uncle, who had torn apart Sophie's life, were the same ones who had been manipulating his family from the shadows. The same ones who had shaped the very empire he had inherited. They think I have a map, Sophie continued. A map to the fortune, your family's fortune. I've spent years running, hiding from them. They think I know where it is, Jackson. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Jackson's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had inherited an empire built on blood, on secrets so dark that they could destroy everything he had worked for. His father, the man who had raised him, had to be involved in all of this. It wasn't possible for the Blake Empire to be so untouchable without some dirty secrets buried deep within. He turned to Sophie, his voice tight with anger and confusion. So what happens now? What do we do? Sophie's expression hardened. We fight back. We go after them before they find me. And we find out the truth about your father and uncle's involvement. But as the words left her lips, the air around them seemed to darken. Sophie had been running for years, and now it was Jackson's turn to run, not from her, but from the danger that was closing in on them both. In the days that followed, Jackson struggled to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. The more he learned about his family's hidden past, the more he questioned everything he had once believed about the Blakes and their wealth. Was it all worth it? Was his family's success based on the blood and suffering of others? His feelings for Sophie deepened, but with those feelings came a rising tide of doubts. Sophie had been a part of a world he never knew existed, a world that threatened to tear apart everything he had worked for. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that, in some twisted way, his and Sophie's fates were intertwined. As he tried to come to terms with the magnitude of the situation, Sophie grew more distant. She feared that Jackson might turn against her once the truth was fully out, that he might see her as nothing more than a pawn in the Blake family's deadly game. You don't know what you're dealing with, Jackson, she said one evening, her voice quiet but filled with fear. These men, they're ruthless. And once they know you're involved, they'll come for you too. They'll stop at nothing. Jackson reached for her, grabbing her hand, desperate to reassure her. I won't turn against you, Sophie. I'm with you. We'll figure this out together. But Sophie pulled back, tears in her eyes. You don't understand. You think it's that simple, but it's not. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what these people are capable of. The tension between them was palpable, and Jackson felt a deep ache in his chest. Trust was a fragile thing, and the secrets that Sophie had kept from him had shattered it. He wasn't sure if he could trust her completely, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let her go. As the days passed, the danger became all too real. The mysterious men who had been tailing Sophie grew more aggressive. Late one evening, as Jackson drove through the city with Sophie in the passenger seat, a black SUV came out of nowhere and tried to run them off the road. The vehicle swerved dangerously close to Jackson's car, and he had to slam on the brakes to avoid a collision. Go! Sophie screamed, her voice panicked. They're after us. Before Jackson could react, another car pulled up alongside theirs, and a man jumped out, trying to grab Sophie from the passenger seat. Jackson slammed the gas pedal to the floor, but the man's hands had already latched onto Sophie's arm. A struggle ensued, and Sophie screamed for Jackson to keep driving. Finally, with a violent jolt, Jackson managed to shake the assailants off, but not before Sophie had been bruised and shaken. As they reached the safety of Jackson's estate, both of them were breathless, shaken, and terrified. The danger was closing in. Sophie's fears had been more than justified. And now Jackson had to decide whether to risk everything, the empire, his family's legacy, and his own life, to stop the man who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The air in Jackson's study felt thick, charged with the weight of the moment. The world outside seemed to have stopped moving as Jackson stood before his father, their faces inches apart, the tension between them almost suffocating. Everything that Jackson had once believed about his family, his legacy, and his place in the world was hanging on the edge of a knife. And now he had no choice but to hear the truth. You've been keeping secrets from me, haven't you? Jackson's voice was low, but it carried the anger and pain of years of unanswered questions. His father, Richard Blake, stood by the window, looking out into the night, the shadow of guilt falling over him. The old man had always been a figure of power, strength, and authority, but tonight, he appeared smaller, more vulnerable. Richard turned slowly, his face hardening as he met Jackson's eyes. What do you think you know? Jackson stepped forward, his fists clenched. I know about Sophie. I know about what happened to her father. And I know you were involved in it. The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Richard remained silent for a long moment, as if considering how much to reveal, but eventually, his posture slumped. He seemed to deflate, as if the weight of his own sins had caught up with him. It wasn't supposed to end like this, Richard muttered, his voice barely audible. I never wanted you to find out, Jackson. But you've already started unraveling it all, haven't you? Jackson's heart hammered in his chest. What did you do? Richard looked at his son for what seemed like the first time in years, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of regret and cold determination. I did what I had to do. What we had to do to protect the Blake fortune. Your uncle, Edward, he was a fool. He thought he could go against me, against us. He was part of a plan, Jackson. A plan to take control of everything your grandfather built. He wanted power. And when he found out the truth about the deal I made with Sophie's father, he wanted to use it against me. He had to be stopped. Jackson's world tilted. His father was admitting to it, to being behind the murder of Sophie's father, to the conspiracy that had brought everything to this point. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk as his voice rose, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. You murdered him. You murdered Sophie's father, just to keep your hold on this empire. Just for more power. Richard's face twisted, his eyes narrowing. Don't make it sound so simple, Jackson. I did what I had to do to survive. To protect us. The world doesn't play fair. You think I wanted to kill him? No. But he was a threat, and I had to neutralize it. Edward was going to destroy everything I had worked for. Sophie's father had a plan, he was working with people who wanted to steal everything from us. It was them or us, son. And I chose us. Jackson was numb. His father, the man he had looked up to, the man who had raised him, had just confessed to being part of the most twisted betrayal imaginable. I didn't know. I never knew this side of you. How could you? Richard's face hardened. I did what needed to be done. But you wouldn't understand, Jackson. You never will. You're not ready for this world. For the first time, Jackson truly saw his father for what he was, a man so obsessed with control, with power, that he was willing to destroy anyone who got in his way. Sophie's father had been just a pawn to him, and Sophie herself, she was nothing more than a threat to be eliminated. But Sophie isn't just some pawn, Father, Jackson spat. She's a person. And you ruined her life. You murdered her father. And now you expect me to just, what? Pretend like none of this ever happened. To carry on with your lies, your blood-stained fortune. Richard's eyes softened for just a moment, but then he turned away, his voice colder than ever. This is your legacy, Jackson. You've always known that. The question is, do you want to inherit it or not? The words hit Jackson like a hammer. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of disillusionment wash over him. The life he had known, the empire he had inherited, it was all based on lies, betrayal, and murder. Sophie's truth had shattered his perception of everything. And now Jackson was forced to make the ultimate decision. Would he continue his father's legacy, knowing the dark truths behind it, or would he destroy everything in pursuit of something more righteous? Just as the room began to feel too small, Sophie appeared at the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had been listening to the confrontation from the hallway, and now, she stepped into the room, her voice trembling. Jackson, I have to tell you something. Her eyes darted nervously between father and son. There's more. Much more than you know. Jackson turned to face her, confusion flooding his mind. What do you mean? What else could there be? Sophie took a deep breath, her expression haunted. There was a secret agreement between your father and my father. A secret they made years ago before everything went wrong. And Jackson, you're not just the heir to the Blake Empire. You are the heir. Not your father. The words crashed through Jackson like a lightning bolt. His entire world seemed to shatter in that moment. What do you mean? I'm the heir. Sophie nodded. Your father was never supposed to inherit the Blake fortune. Your uncle Edward was meant to, but he betrayed the deal, and when he died, your father took control by manipulating everything. But it was you, Jackson. You were always the one meant to inherit it all. You were the rightful heir. Jackson staggered back, his mind reeling. He had spent his entire life thinking that the empire he had inherited was the product of his father's work, but now, he was learning that it had all been a lie. His father's entire position, his power, had been built on deceit, manipulation, and murder. Sophie's eyes were filled with sorrow as she added, I'm sorry, Jackson. I didn't know how to tell you. But you've been used. We both have. Jackson felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his legacy, and his place in the world was now nothing but smoke and mirrors. His father, the man who had controlled him his whole life, was the true villain in this story, not just in his own life, but in Sophie's as well. With the weight of the truth pressing down on him, Jackson stood silently for a long time. His hands were trembling, and his thoughts were a blur. He had the power to expose everything, every secret, every lie, every murder. But that would mean tearing down everything he had ever known. His father, the empire, his future, all of it would be gone in an instant. But then Sophie stepped forward, her hand reaching out to him. Her touch was gentle, soothing, and in that moment, Jackson realized what he had to do. He could no longer live in the shadow of his father's lies. He couldn't let this legacy of blood and betrayal continue any longer. I'm going to expose the truth, Jackson said quietly. His voice was steady now, filled with resolve. I'm going to tear down everything that's built on lies. I'll destroy the empire if I have to, because it's based on something rotten. Something that will never bring me peace. Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. You don't have to do this, Jackson. You've done enough. You've done more than anyone could ever expect of you. But Jackson shook his head. No, Sophie. I can't live like this. I can't live with a legacy that's built on murder and deceit. For a long time, Sophie was silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice calm but resolute. If you do this, Jackson, everything we know will be gone. The life we thought we had, the safety, the power, everything will change. Jackson nodded. I know. But I'm willing to face it. I'd rather start over with nothing than continue living a lie. Sophie's face softened and she finally smiled, small but genuine. Then we'll rebuild together. Not as heirs to corrupt fortunes but as partners. We'll build something real. Something based on truth. In that moment, Jackson knew he had made the right choice. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be filled with uncertainty, danger, and loss. But for the first time, he felt free. Free from the shackles of his father's empire, free from the lies, and free to create a new future. Together they would face whatever came next, no longer as pawns in a game they hadn't chosen, but as two people determined to make their own fate. The Blake Empire was about to fall. And with it, Jackson and Sophie would rise. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the horizon. Jackson and Sophie stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the sprawling estate that had once been the center of the Blake Empire. The mansion, now empty and abandoned, stood as a haunting reminder of the power and corruption that had once thrived within its walls. But for Jackson and Sophie, this was no longer a symbol of their past, this was simply a chapter that had ended, one that they were ready to leave behind. For so long, Jackson had been trapped within the confines of his family's legacy, the riches, the influence, the power that came with being a Blake. But now, as he stood there with Sophie, he understood that none of that mattered anymore. The empire he had once inherited, the wealth that had been built on lies and bloodshed, was gone. And in its place was something new, something real. "We don't need any of this," Jackson said softly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. He looked at Sophie, his gaze steady. "We have each other, and we have a chance to make things right." Sophie's lips curved into a small but genuine smile. She had seen Jackson transform over the course of their journey, from the arrogant heir of a crumbling empire to a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. He had shed the skin of his family's legacy, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable, his own soul. "It's strange," Sophie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "To think that something so broken could lead to something beautiful." Jackson took her hand in his fingers brushing against hers as they stood there, the weight of the past beginning to lift. "We've seen the worst of what people can do," he said. "But we've also seen what people can overcome. What we can overcome." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. "And we'll rebuild, Jackson. We'll rebuild, not with power or money, but with trust and love. We've both lost so much, me, my family, my past. You, your inheritance, your place in this world. But we still have a chance to build something new." They turned away from the mansion, walking slowly toward the future, leaving behind the broken empire that had once been their cage. As they walked hand in hand, Jackson realized that his journey had not been about finding wealth, power, or success. It had been about discovering who he truly was. And in the process, he had discovered a love and trust that no fortune could ever replace. As the last remnants of the Blake Empire fell into ruin behind them, Jackson and Sophie stepped forward into a new world, one that was free from the chains of their past. Their lives were no longer defined by their families or their wealth, but by their decisions and the path they chose together. They used the resources they had left to help those who had been hurt by the corruption that had once consumed their families, people who had lost everything in the pursuit of power. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild the communities torn apart by the actions of men who had long since forgotten what it meant to care. Jackson found peace in this new life, one built on honesty, integrity, and purpose. He had realized that true wealth wasn't in gold or land, but in the ability to make a difference. The empire he had inherited was a burden, one that had weighed him down for so long. But now, as he walked beside Sophie, he felt lighter than he had ever felt before. He understood that true freedom came not from what you had, but from who you chose to become. For Sophie, the journey had been even more personal. She had left behind the shadows of her past, the pain of losing her father and the betrayal of her family. She had spent so many years running, living in fear of those who would try to control her, but now, with Jackson by her side, she had a sense of belonging she had never known. She had found not just a partner, but a true equal, a man who understood the value of rebuilding from the ground up. As they stood together, watching the first stars appear in the night sky, Jackson's mind drifted back over the tumultuous journey that had brought him here. He had once believed that wealth and power defined success. He had once thought that inheriting an empire meant inheriting greatness. But now, as he looked at Sophie, he knew that true greatness was something entirely different. It wasn't the wealth that mattered. It wasn't the empire, the mansion, or the name that had once been his birthright. It was the ability to live honestly, to choose love over power, and to forge a path that was entirely his own. Jackson realized that freedom was not just about the wealth you inherited, but about the courage to let go of the past and build something real. It was about breaking free from the chains of legacy and creating a life that meant something, a life based on trust, not deception, on truth, not lies. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Blake felt truly free. With Sophie by his side, he walked away from the ruins of his family's empire. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Together they would build something entirely their own, not as heirs to a corrupt fortune, but as two people bound by their shared journey, their love, and their resolve to create a new beginning. The Blake Empire was gone. But what Jackson and Sophie were about to create was something far more meaningful. And that, Jackson realized, was where his true legacy would begin.